Well, good morning. I'm Matthew, one of the pastors, and I was able to teach a couple weeks ago, and I had a fun little story to intro, and I talked about eating milk duds and listening to music on long car rides, and I have no such thing for you today. We're just going to dive right in because we have a lot of ground to cover and a really exciting topic and series and even text that we're doing today. If you've read the Gospels much, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, you've noticed that Jesus speaks often in parables. Parables are these like little stories with layers and textures designed to teach us deep spiritual truths. They uncover truth, and they do it in like a creative and a potent kind of packs a punch kind of way. And we all know this, right? That telling a story can be a powerful means to communicate truth. And we're drawn to story for that reason, right? And so it's not surprising then that we find Jesus not very often lecturing, not very often kind of doing classroom style teaching. He is often telling stories. He's harnessing kind of the stuff of everyday life to explain the unseen spiritual realities, okay? And the parables tell us what the kingdom of God is like. The kingdom is that thing that Jesus spoke about more than anything else. It's what he declared at his coming, right? It was sort of when he entered out or moved into his public ministry. He said essentially, where I am, the kingdom is. The kingdom has come in me. He talked about it right out of the gate when he made that shift to being in ministry, and then he just never stopped talking about it. What is the kingdom? The kingdom is the vision of what life looks like when Jesus is the king and when we are restored into right relationship with him, right? The kingdom, Scripture tells us, and what theologians love to talk about, is already but not yet, meaning that it's not yet here. It hasn't come in full. It won't do that until Jesus returns and Satan is vanquished, right? And Jesus will rule on a renewed earth, and we will be in his presence in resurrected bodies, and all the groaning of creation, all that's broken and not right about this world will be silenced, and God's shalom is the air that we breathe. So it's not yet, but it's also here now. The church, H2O Church and every other church that bears the name of Jesus Christ, right, by its very life and existence bears witness to this kingdom. So in a real way, in a tangible, tactile, physical, but yet spiritual way, we as a church demonstrate to the world what this future kingdom looks like now. We anticipate it in the way that we live, both individually and as a community. And it's this lofty vision, and honestly, frankly, we don't talk about it enough in the church. It seems maybe too grand for us. It's too far off. It's hard to imagine. It's hard to kind of sink our teeth into. And I think this is where the parables become so helpful to us, and why I think Jesus loved to teach using them, because they paint a picture of this reality that can be so difficult to imagine. The parables, just a bit more on those before we dive into the text. They are incisive. They cut deep. They expose falsehoods and misconceptions. They're meant to challenge. They're meant to cause us to rethink our assumptions. In fact, when Jesus was asked why he spoke in parables, someone asked him that. He quotes Isaiah, and he essentially says, my sort of reading of it is, because only those with faith will understand. Now that's fascinating. That's the whole teaching in that. He essentially says, so that those who have the eyes of faith will grow deeper in their knowledge and their experience of God. And those who do not have faith, those who reject, will continue in their not believing. They cut deep. And as we will see today, they often invite us to redefine the very essence of our faith. So we're going to tackle three of, I think, the most fundamental aspects of Christianity today. We're going to talk about God, sin, and salvation, and the ways in which this parable that or these three parables that we're going to cover today address God, sin, and salvation. Those are words that get tossed around a lot in a church, right? But also words that maybe, for some of us at least, may need some redefinition. And so we'll get into that in a second. But first I want to start with this. If you've been around here at H2O, you've heard this quote. I love to quote it. I know others love to quote it. I think it's so insightful. A.W. Tozer, famous pastor, writer, thinker, said this: what comes to our minds when we think about God is the most important thing about us. The most fateful fact about any man is not what he at any given time may say or do, but what he in his deep heart conceives God to be like. Tiffany and I love seeing faith forming in our kids. We love when they ask us questions about God. We love asking them questions about what they believe about God and what he is like. And it's fascinating to see that grow over time. We now have a teenager, and we have an 11-year-old, and it's just really fun to see them go from like, what's God like? He's big. He's so big. That's what they say when they're like 3 or 4. He's so big, to this recognition today in our older kids that he is near, that he is present to them in every moment, that he is not far off, that he knows their thoughts, and he wants to draw near to them. It's just a really cool thing to see their knowledge and understanding of God expand over time. But I wonder, for all of us, before we dive into the text, how would we answer that question? Who is God to you? What comes to your mind when you think of God? And more importantly, is your experience aligned with that? If you were to answer the question, right? So God is loving, God is gracious, God is kind, he's merciful, he's forgiving. Is your experience of God that? Or is it something different? If I were to ask you, have you experienced whatever adjectives you would use to describe God, how have you experienced that? Would you have stories to tell of the ways in which you have really encountered God in those ways? And so today we're going to be in Luke chapter 15. It's a story containing 3 parables, actually, and there's something significant happening in this triplet of stories, something that's meant to get our attention and to get us thinking and draw us into its meaning. And I want to start by reading the context. It is so important for us to read Scripture in context and to not miss what's happening in the bigger picture. So in the first 2 verses of chapter 15 of Luke, it says this: now, the tax collectors and sinners were all gathering around to hear Jesus. But the Pharisees and the teachers of the law muttered, "This man welcomes sinners and eats with them." In the ESV, that word for muttered is grumbled. They were grumbling that Jesus would be spending time with, doing something as intimate and as friendship-bearing as having a meal with these so-called sinners and tax collectors. And so, right off the bat, we learn there's 2 groups of people, right? There's the religious folks, and then there's the riffraff, okay? The sinners and the tax collectors basically is code for those undeserving of God's mercy. Those who are just so far gone, they're not even like in the realm of possibility that God would want anything to do with them. And then those who were really, really, really righteous. 2 groups of people on the outside who are wildly different. And the spiritual folks, they're not just perplexed. They're not just like confused. Hey, what's Jesus doing eating with these people? They're angry. They're frustrated. They're mad. They're whispering to each other, doesn't this guy know who these people are? Why would he want to eat with them? Why would he want to? And so Jesus is going to respond. But he's not going to respond by like going on this lofty sermon or this lecture. Instead, he's going to tell a story. He's going to use parable to communicate a really profound point. Okay? We'll breeze through the first 2 parables, and then we'll camp out in the last one. So if you go with me to verse 4 of chapter 15, Jesus starts off and he says, "Suppose one of you has 100 sheep and loses one of them. Doesn't he leave the 99 in the open country and go after the lost sheep until he finds it? And when he finds it, he joyfully puts it on his shoulders and goes home. And then he calls his friends and his neighbors together and says, 'Rejoice with me, I have found my lost sheep.' I tell you that in the same way, there will be more rejoicing in heaven over one sinner who repents than over 99 righteous persons who do not need to repent." So Jesus tells a story. He uses images and characters that were common in that day, right? Sheep and shepherds. And for this moment right here today, I just want us to take note that there were 100 sheep, and one of them gets lost. There were 100, and one gets lost. Now let's move quickly to the next parable, verse 8. Or suppose a woman has 10 silver coins and loses one. Doesn't she light a lamp, sweep the house, and search carefully until she finds it? And when she finds it, listen to the similarities, she calls her friends and her neighbors together and says, "Rejoice with me, I have found my lost coin." In the same way, I tell you, there is rejoicing in the presence of the angels of God over one sinner who repents. Did you see what happened? We went from 100 sheep now to 10 coins. The number is decreasing, but the scope, the value of the loss is increasing. It stings much more to lose one when you only have 10, right? So tuck that away. Did you notice how each of these parables ends? With a comment about what? The rejoicing of heaven. So if A.W. Tozer is right, and what's most important about us is what we think of God, and we're wrestling with the question today, and I think most days of our life, if we're honest, we're wrestling with who is God and what is He like. Maybe the best window into that answer lies in the answer to this question. What makes His heart joyful? What makes Him celebrate? What does God love to celebrate? What does God love to throw a party for? Think about your own life, right? What makes you come alive? What's the thing that brings you the greatest joy, makes you want to celebrate? The thing that maybe brings you to joyful tears that you can't even talk about without getting choked up because there's so much joy in it. I suspect that whatever those things are for you would tell me a great deal about who you are. And if he hasn't hinted at it enough yet, Luke is going to make it crystal clear in this third and most popular parable what exactly it is that makes God rejoice. What makes God's heart come alive. And if we can lay hold of that, then I think we'll know a great deal about who He is. So let's go to 15, starting in verse 11. Jesus continued, "There was a man who had 2 sons. The younger one said to his father, 'Father, give me my share of the estate.' So he divided his property between them. Not long after that, the younger son got together all he had, set off for a distant country, and there squandered his wealth in wild living." We'll stop there. So we went from 100 sheep to 10 coins to now 2 sons. We went from what is relatively the least precious to what is the most precious. And see, what Luke is doing, what Jesus was doing in his preaching and his teaching, was he's stringing together these parables in this order for a divine purpose. The point he is trying to make is intensifying. He's trying to get our attention. We're leaning in at this point, wondering, oh my gosh, there's only 2 sons, and one of them is lost. One of them is leaving, right? But the thing is, he isn't just leaving. He's done something much more piercing than that. I think in our world, I wouldn't know this. I have a teenager now. I wouldn't know this. A little bit of disrespect for your parents is normal, I think. I don't know. I've been told. But in this day, there's no other option than to respect the patriarch of the family. He was the centerpiece, and his children's vision for their life would have been to bring him honor. And their greatest fear is that they would bring shame to their family's name, to their father's name, right? And so when this son asks his dad for the inheritance, while he is still living, he is saying, in effect, I wish you were dead. I wish to have nothing more to do with you for the rest of my life. Again, I want us to get this. This young man's entire worldview would have been, I must honor my father and his legacy. And so when Jesus is telling this parable, I'm just imagining the listeners being in complete shock that he would even tell a story that goes like this. In a lot of ways today, I feel like I'm weaving together a couple of my favorite thinkers, sort of writers, authors, Henry Nouwen and Tim Keller, and that'll come forward. You'll see that as this teaching keeps going on. But Nouwen writes, when Luke writes, and left for a distant country, when this younger son leaves for a distant country, he indicates much more than the desire of a young man to go and to see more of the world. He speaks about a drastic cutting loose from the way of living, thinking, and acting that has been handed down to him from generation to generation. Listen to this, as a sacred legacy. But the more shocking part of the story than even what the son does is that the father agrees to do it. Okay, so a son walking up to their dad in this day and saying, hey, I kind of wish you were dead. Can I just have the inheritance now? That would have pushed the listener's imagination. But a father agreeing to divide up his inheritance would have blown their minds. It would have been inconceivable. There would have been no category for that sort of thing. And what the listeners would have expected, right, is, and then the father banished him, and then the father believed him to be dead to him, or then the father beat him physically as a justifiable response. And this is where, again, the context helps us to see just how wild of a story this is. People in this time, they didn't have bank accounts, they didn't have retirement plans, they didn't have investments. What did they have? They had land and they had animals. And that's why it says the father divided up his property. So he is literally, in the story that Jesus is telling, he is selling off his property and he is giving the proceeds of that to his younger son. And can you imagine the shame and the embarrassment of the father, having to explain to the people around him why he was doing what he was doing? And yet he let him go. He let him go. The father allowed the hurt and the shame to be brought upon himself willingly. Let's keep reading down verse 14. After he had spent everything, so the younger son who's ran away, after he had spent everything, there was a severe famine in that whole country, and he began to be in need. So he went and hired himself out to a citizen of that country who sent him to his fields to feed pigs. He longed to fill his stomach with the pods that the pigs were eating, but no one gave him anything. So he lost everything. He hit rock bottom. He's broke. He's starving. He's wishing he could eat the pig food. And I think sometimes that's true of all of us. We have to go to the lowest spot just to realize how lost we are. That's absolutely what's happening with this guy. But still, he knows that his father is a good man. He knows that he's a kind man, so he makes this plan to redeem himself. And his plan tells us what he thinks about himself and what he assumes about his dad. Verse 17, when he came to his senses, he said, how many of my father's hired servants have food to spare? And here I am starving to death. I will set out and go back to my father and say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired servants. So he got up and went to his father. Did you notice that he asks to be a hired servant? Servants don't live on the patriarch's estate. They live in the village. They don't have a real relationship with the father or with the one who hires them. They work and they earn a wage. So what does that tell us? His plan was to pay his father back. He did not think for a second that it could get any better than that. It was the best he could do, right? And what happens next, he could not have imagined. Starting in verse 20. But while he was still a long way off, the father saw him and was filled with compassion for him. He ran to his son, threw his arms around him, and kissed him. The son said to him, Father, I've sinned against heaven, against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. But the father said to his servants, Quick, bring the best robe and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet. Bring the fattened calf and kill it. Let's have a feast and celebrate. For this son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found. And so they began to celebrate. Everybody listening to the story thought that the father would be harsh and severe and would verbally, if not physically, attack this young man in the story. And instead, the father runs to him. And he runs because he's apparently been waiting. It says, while he was still a long way off. And so the image that Jesus wants the listeners to hear is of this father waiting, sitting and waiting for his lost son to come back. It would have blown their minds. No sense of a father that good, that kind. He gives him a hug, a kiss, a robe, a ring, sandals, and the party of a lifetime. He says, give him the best robe. Guess which robe that would have been? The Father's robe, his own robe. Jesus is harnessing the most powerful and shocking imagery to help us capture the sheer joy of the Father. The sheer and absolute joy of the Father. He does not even allow the Son to recite his well-rehearsed speech. He cuts him off, and he starts in with the party plans now and again, says, not only does the Father forgive without asking questions and joyfully welcomes his lost son home, but he cannot wait to give him new life. Life in abundance. So strongly does God desire to give life to his returning son that he seems almost impatient. Let's just get this party started. Let's kill the fattened calf. The Father does not simply forgive. He celebrates. Don't miss that. He doesn't just forgive. He celebrates. He is not only kind in his mercy, he is extravagant in his mercy. And here we find the first of three things that we're going to talk through quickly that Jesus redefines in this story. The first one is he redefines God. The Father in this parable, if it's not obvious, represents God. And this is what Jesus is teaching us. God is not vicious. He is not vengeful. He is not vindictive. He will judge. He is just, but he will never take pleasure in punishment, and his heart is for us, never against us. He is exceedingly generous in his love and his compassion. He is not stingy. He is the tender Father who wants to restore us. And I know that there are some people out there who present God in other ways, and maybe down deep they mean well, and they're certainly harnessing some element of truth. I think of the preachers that come to campus and they yell and they scream and they hold their signs and they present a God who is impatient, angry, and ready to make an example of somebody. Maybe you've been wounded by someone with that perspective. This is who our God has always been. Listen to Psalm 103, written centuries before Jesus came to earth. The Lord is compassionate and gracious, slow to anger, and abounding in love. As a father has compassion on his children, so the Lord has compassion on those who fear him. For he knows how we are formed. He remembers that we are dust. Is this how you view God? And maybe more importantly, is this how you experience God? I worry that many of us are shackled by shame, believing the things that we have done or that we're currently doing somehow they cast us outside the boundary lines of God's grace. So what happens when we start thinking that way? Well, we probably stop talking about those things that we're doing, right? We don't share them with the people in our lives. We go quiet about our sin and our brokenness. And then we strive in our own power to maybe just do enough. Just do whatever it takes just to keep God off our back, to keep him from casting us far off. Why? Because we can't imagine a God who sees all of it, who knows every last shred of it, and then actually runs toward us to give us new life when we come humble. I think sometimes we stop here when we engage with this text, and I think there's good reason for that. There's enough to chew on just right there in talking about the younger son, but the story actually hasn't even reached its climax yet. There's a whole other character that we have to meet. So we're going to go to verse 25. It says, meanwhile, the older son, so we're meeting the second son, the older son was in the field. When he came near the house, he heard music and, listen to this, dancing. The Bible approves of dancing. It's right here, guys. Okay, 26. I still don't do it, but it's cool if you do. 26. So he called one of the servants, and he asked him what was going on. Your brother has come home, he replied, and your father has killed the fattened calf because he has him back safe and sound. The older brother became angry and refused to go in. He won't go to the party. So his father went out and pleaded with him. But he answered his father, look, all of these years I've been slaving for you, and I never disobeyed your orders, yet you never gave me even a young goat so I could celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours who has squandered your property with prostitutes comes home, you killed a fattened calf for him. My son, the father said, you are always with me, and everything I have is yours. But we had to celebrate and be glad, because this brother of yours was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found. He is all worked up about this fattened calf. Like, what is the deal with the chubby little cow? Okay, it helps us, again, to understand the context. Meat is a delicacy in that world. The fattened calf was the best of the best. It was an incredibly rare occasion to eat it. It was reserved for only the most precious, monumental of events. And this older brother simply cannot comprehend why such a gift would be wasted on his brother. He was the one who did everything right. He says, I never disobeyed your orders. He was the responsible one. He was the faithful one, the good son. But did you notice the first words out of his mouth to his father? He says, look. He speaks to him in a really disrespectful way. Something is coming out of this guy that has been brewing in there for a long time. He did not address his father with respect, and then he keeps talking, and more of his heart gets revealed. He says, all of these years I have been slaving for you. Now, this parable is just layered with meaning, and I could go on and on, but just one thing I want to point out. Do you see the irony, the tragic similarity in these two brothers? The younger son, when he comes to his senses, what is his plan? His plan is essentially, I'm going to be a slave. I will go and I will work, and I will pay back I will essentially assume the role of a slave to pay my father back. And the older son has always seen himself as that. It's a slave, just doing the work. His service had become slavery to him. The joy of laboring alongside his dad vanished. Jesus is inviting us to go beyond the surface here. Yes, the older son has been obedient. Yes, he's been hardworking. Yes, he's probably been outwardly faultless, but his response to his father's joy reveals something very broken inside of him. Again, Henry Nouwen says, when confronted by his father's joy at the return of his younger brother, a dark power erupts in him and boils to the surface. Suddenly there becomes a glaringly visible, a resentful, proud, unkind, and selfish person. This is not the story of a lost son. This is the story of two lost sons. For all their differences, there is this tragic similarity. They are both, at one point, far from the heart of the Father. They do not have his heart. They want his stuff. They don't want him. They don't want to be in relationship with him. They don't want to have his heart and become like him. They just want his stuff. And Tim Keller, who I owe a lot of this message to, he wrote this amazing book called Prodigal God that I think you should all read. He exposes this strange similarity between these two. He said, neither son loved the father for himself. They were both using the Father for their own self-centered ends rather than loving, enjoying, and serving him for his own sake. Listen to this connection he makes, right? He says, this means that you can rebel against God and be alienated from him either by breaking his rules, that one we probably know, or by keeping all of them diligently. It is a shocking message. Careful obedience to God's law may serve as a strategy for rebelling against God. See, the second thing that Jesus is redefining is sin. He's setting up this massive contrast between these two sons, and yet at the same time, he is revealing that in some way they are the same. And the point he is making is this, and this is Keller's take: you can be lost in your badness, and you can be lost in your goodness. Sin is not just the bad that we do, it is also the impure motives for the good that we do. Sin, listen to this, guys. Sin is not simply breaking God's law. It is living without God's heart. It is so natural for us. We just want to divide the world in these two neat and tidy characters. You got the good people and you got the bad people. And somehow we always seem to write ourselves into the good people category. Right? But if this is the standard of what sin is, who of us can claim to be righteous? If it's not enough just to follow the rules, who can claim to be good? And I think this is the whole point of the parable. We cannot save ourselves. We cannot achieve our own salvation. Salvation is never achieved. It is always received. Never achieved, always received. See, Jesus is redefining salvation. Remember, he's weaving together a story to address what was happening in verses 1 and 2. The younger brother represents the sinners and the tax collectors who are looking for life and worshiping the things of this world. The older brother represents the Pharisees, the teachers of the law, who have obeyed everything and invented some more laws along the way, who have staked their salvation on their morality. And Jesus is saying, neither path will lead you to life. Neither path has the power to rescue you. And so my question is, which brother are you in this season of your life? Chasing after the things of the world and then coming to God with your repayment plan? I know I did this. I know that I'm struggling with this. I know that I gave into this. I know that I keep going back to this. So here's what I'm going to do. God, to make it right to you, I'm going to serve a little bit more. I'm going to read my Bible a little bit more. I'm going to try to pray a little bit more. I'm going to try to serve. I'm going to outdo my bad with good now. Just give me some time. I'll make it right. Or maybe you're still running away. You're imagining that you're too far gone. Can I say this? Some of the most profound moments in my own walk with Jesus have come when I've returned. When I've stood face to face with my brokenness, and I've received from my wife and my friends the love of the Father that we see here. Those are the stories that I will never forget. Maybe that's where you are. Maybe you need to experience that today. Or are you the brother who just refuses to go into the party? Someone who lives with these clear-cut boundaries of who's in and who's out, who questions in their heart if God would ever even want to save those people. Regardless of which one you relate to, the invitation is to turn back to the Father. It's to do what the younger son did when he came to his senses. It's to echo what David said in the aftermath of his own sin in Psalm 51. Deliver me from the guilt of bloodshed, O God. You who are God, my Savior, and my tongue will sing of your righteousness. Open my lips, Lord, and my mouth will declare your praise. You do not delight in sacrifice, or I would bring it. You do not take pleasure in burnt offerings. My sacrifice, O God, is a broken spirit, a broken and contrite heart, God, you will not despise. The father in the parable took upon himself the shame of his sons, the shame of his younger son for demanding the inheritance, the shame of the older son for refusing to go into the party that he had thrown. Jesus Christ took our shame upon himself. Jesus is the Father in the parable, and his invitation is simple. Come to me. Come to me in all your brokenness and all your sin. Come humble, come needy. Receive from me the immeasurable riches of my kindness to you. And I just wonder, what if we did that today? And we experience down deep in our bones what it's like to have the untamed, unrestrained love of God poured out over our lives. The psalmists love to talk about this idea that we become like that which we worship. If you worship idols, you will become like those idols, right? You'll have eyes, but you won't see. You'll have ears, but you won't hear. If we worship the one true God, we will become like him. We are all at some point one of the brothers. We are all prodigals. I came to Jesus at 19 as the younger, and I go to him so very often these days as the older. But the invitation over my life, over all of our lives, is to become like the Father. Our return to the Father is ultimately an invitation to become like the Father. Right? Following Jesus has always been about becoming like Jesus, not just for our sake, but for the sake of the world, that our lives would be a gift to give to this world. Could you imagine? And I would challenge you to do that as you walk away from here today. Can you imagine what God might do through you? What God might do through this church if we lived like the Father? May we hold out the extravagant love of God, and may many more come to know our God of scandalous mercy. Would you bow your heads and pray with me?